Well, good morning, Vanessa. I will let people in as they arrive. I will start with welcoming who we have here for the Safety for Your Business webinar. Thank you for joining us. A few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, please place them in the chat. We will be viewing the questions as we go through the various presentations and answering questions at the end of each section. I want to welcome Vanessa Foss, the branch manager of Vallen, Saskatoon. And she's going to start us off with a quick overview and safety moment before we get started. Thank you, Vanessa. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I am Vanessa Foss, branch manager here at Vallen in Saskatoon, and our topic today is safety for your business. We have 3 diverse and engaging vendor partners that will be speaking to Brad Young from 3M Safety will be speaking to the CSA changes to SRL. Gord Hayes from Keto Canada, inspections before and after the use of chain hoists. And Jonathan Cadet from Purell Gojo to speak about health and hygiene in the workplace. With that, we will go into a safety moment. Stephanie. Thank you. Sunscreen safety. For outdoor workers, sun exposure is a primary source of skin cancer and heat stress. Outdoor workers are at higher risk of both conditions. They often have more sun exposure than the workplace exposure limits. Between 1.5 million and 5.4 million Canadians are exposed to sun on the job. Of these workers, about 67% spend 2 or more working hours in the sun every workday. Implement a sun safety program. Take frequent breaks. Modify the work site by increasing the amount of shade available, for example, with tent shelters and cooling stations. Decreasing UV reflection by covering bright or shiny surfaces. And create work schedules that minimize sun exposure. I understand that we hopefully will have summer here starting next week. So hopefully this will pertain to that beautiful summer that we've got coming to us. Today's first presentation will be done by Brad Young with 3M. And it's over to you, Brad.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Vanessa. So yeah, my name is Brad Young. I'm the 3M safety specialist here in Saskatchewan. And today I'm going to be covering off some of the key changes that occurred over the last really couple of years, almost 2 years, regarding the CSA Z259 standard. Next slide. So first off, I want to talk about self-retracting devices, or SRLs. The previous version of the standard was Z259.2.2-14. So it was written in 2014. It came into effect in 2016. There's a 2-year period there. Many manufacturers continued to manufacture the SRLs to the 1998 version of the standard at that time. So the new version, 259.2.2-17. So it was written in 2017, but it did take a couple of years to actually implement. So August 1st of 2019 was the initiation date for the new standard. So currently now all manufacturers are making product to the new CSA standard. So the standard covers self-retracting devices as well as personal fall limiters, which are really SRLs. They're just smaller and worn on the harness. It also covers self-retracting devices with retrieval and a whole new classification of self-retracting devices referred to as leading edge SRLs. Next slide. So the first big change within the standard was the new classifications for retractable lifelines. If anyone on the call is familiar with SRLs, the previous version of the standard had SRLs classified into 3 types. So there is a type 1, type 2, type 3. Those no longer exist. So under the new standard, type 1, type 2, type 3 are gone. Okay. Now, of course, there's plenty of product in the field that was manufactured and approved to the previous version of the standard. Those just get grandfathered in. Can you please move back to that last slide? Thank you. So the new classifications. So first classification is just a class SRL, which is a self-retracting lifeline. The main, I guess, the defining specification for this class is that it requires an elevated anchorage. So any class SRL must be anchored at or above dorsal D-ring height of the worker. Okay. And any extracted lifeline cannot bear against an edge or surface during a fall arrest event. The next classification is an SRL-R. So essentially the same thing as an SRL. However, and a -R has the integral rescue capability built in. So it has a means of raising or lowering a fallen worker. The third classification is SRL-LE. So this is that new leading edge classification. So an SRL with an SRL-LE classification can be anchored below the elevation of the dorsal D-ring on the worker's full body harness. So under the new standard, by default, if a worker is going to be anchoring off their retractable lifeline below the dorsal D-ring of their harness, they must be using a class SRL-LE device. These devices are also designed and tested and approved so that extracted lifeline can bear against an edge or surface during a fall arrest event. The device will perform as required. The risk that you run having a worker utilizing a standard class SRL in a configuration where they're anchoring below dorsal D-ring height and where that extracted lifeline can bear against the edge, in a fall event, that device could fail. Okay, it's not tested and rated and approved to be used in that configuration. And then the last classification is an SRL-LE-R. So same deal, it's a leading edge SRL, but it also has the integral rescue built in, so a raise and lower function. Next slide. So to summarize the changes, really any SRL used below the back D-ring tested to the new standard must be leading edge. If there's a product that was approved under previous version of the standard that was tested and approved in a certain configuration, then you can use it that way. Like it gets grandfathered in. For example, DBI Sala made a product called the Nanolock, and under the old standard, it was tested and approved where it could be anchored up to 3 feet below the back D-ring. That's still the case. You can still use that product in that manner. Just moving forward, any new products manufactured to the new standard must be used in the configuration that they're approved for. Recertification. So the term recertification has been changed to revalidation. And I will I'll go into more detail in the next slide, but the old standard, if you recall, had an arbitrary recertification frequency. So it used to be 2 years from the date of manufacture and annually thereafter. That is no longer the case under the new standard. Now, if you've got, again, product approved to the old standard, you follow the old standard. It just gets grandfathered. But all product approved to the new standard falls under the new revalidation rules, which I will cover on the next slide. One thing to understand is that it is no longer, it's not up to 3M as a manufacturer. It's not up to our distributors like Vallen to determine what that revalidation interval is, it's now up to the end user to have a competent person make that decision. And it still makes sense again on the next slide, but SRLs that are made the previous standard, you follow that same inspection recertification criteria. Where a self-retracting device is deemed not repairable or access to the mechanicals renders the device unusable, then the manufacturer shall provide other inspection requirements and a service life for the device. So that would apply to some of the shorter stuff, the 6 foot, possibly up to 20-foot lengths, where those SRLs they're just not repairable, right? They use them once they no longer pass a competent inspection, they would just simply be removed from service. So a competent person, they need to know the categories and how to apply them to the product for their company. Also, you got to, record keeping is critical. So as far as annual competent person inspections, those records need to be kept, as that's really going to determine when an SRL is sent in for revalidation. Next slide. So here's the revalidation frequency table. So number one, the revalidation of an SRL is now triggered by a competent person. Okay, so it's no longer 2 years from the date of manufacture, annually thereafter. Of course, unless it's an older SRL that was made under the previous standard. So if there's a failed daily use inspection, or if there's a failed competent person inspection, that would trigger a revalidation of the SRL. If you look at the chart, this is really intended to give guidance to the end user and to that competent person for when they're doing their inspections, as far as how often is the inspections required, and then how often would a revalidation potentially be required. So it's broken down into type of use. So you've got infrequent to light use, moderate to heavy use, and severe to continuous use. And then there's some application examples in the table as well. So this table, by the way, is taken straight out of the CSA standard. So if you look at, let's look at moderate to heavy, right? So you're utilizing an SRL, every other day. You got fair storage conditions, indoor and maybe some outdoor use in all temperatures, clean or dusty environments. Typical transportation industry, residential construction, utility companies, warehousing, that kind of stuff. In this example, worker inspection frequency is always before each use, right? There's always a pre-use inspection required by the actual user. Competent person inspection frequency in this example, moderate to heavy use, would be semi-annual to annual. So every 6 to 12 months, a competent person would perform a visual inspection on the device. The revalidation frequency would be at least every 2 years, okay? But no more than intervals required by the manufacturer. So if the manufacturer placed tighter intervals than that on their product for whatever reason, then you would default to that. But at minimum, it would be a revalidation of every 2 years. Severe to continuous use, commercial construction, oil and gas, mining, foundry, just as some examples. You've got harsh conditions, prolonged use, outdoors, all temperatures, really dirty environments. A competent person inspection frequency could be quarterly to semi-annually, and the revalidation frequency of that self-retracting device would be at least annually. Okay, so I guess the real main thing here is that it's no longer just 2 years from the date of manufacture, annually thereafter. That's gone. It's now based on the end user's assessment of their own use and that competent person inspection, which would trigger the revalidation. Next slide. So 3M did publish a white paper that kind of highlighted all of the changes to the SRL standard. So if that's, it can be found online, but if you want a copy, just ask your contact from Vallen to get you a copy, and we can make sure that that happens. Next slide. The next change that happened within the CSA standard was regarding personal energy absorbers and lanyards. So shock absorbing lanyards. Probably the biggest change would be the way that they were classified before. So you may be familiar with the old E4, E6 classifications for shock absorbing lanyards. No longer exists. Okay, so E4, E6 is no longer a thing. Again, product made to the previous version, lots of it out there, just gets grandfathered in. Next slide. So today, under the new standard, CSA no longer dictates what the worker mass ranges are. It's now up to the manufacturer to define their mass range for their product, and then CSA tests the product to ensure it performs within the parameters that they've got in place for basically force loading on the individual in the event of a fall. So for 3M, for the DBI Sala and Protector product lines, there's essentially 4 worker mass ranges depending on the type of shock absorber that's integrated into the lanyard. So with our shock pack styles, you'll have a worker mass range of 121 to 310 pounds, or a worker mass range of 176 to 420 pounds, and depending on the specific product. If it's a tubular web style shock absorbing lanyard, you've got a worker mass range of 132 to 253 pounds, or 176 to 385 pounds. Next slide. So what CSA is doing with shock absorbing lanyards now is they're testing them within these parameters. So they're looking at deceleration requirements. So without going into too much detail, and because we're limited for time here, basically this kind of summarizes it up. There's a maximum deceleration of 10 G, okay? Deceleration between 8 to 10 G can only last for up to 0.1 of a second. And then the average deceleration needs to be between 2.3 G and up to including 7 G. So when you look at G-force, a lot of people will relate that to acceleration, right? Accelerating in a car or a jet or whatever. But we're talking about deceleration G-forces when we're talking about, fall arrest. So to kind of put it into perspective, right? A maximum deceleration of 10 G. Well, if a heavyweight boxer punched you in the face, their fist would decelerate at about 58 Gs against your face. So that kind of put it into perspective in terms of the amount of forces involved. The average concussion that occurs in sports, the deceleration that person experiences on their head is between 80 to 100 Gs. So the forces we're dealing with a shock absorbing lanyard need to be maximized at 10 Gs and then fall within those other criteria. Next slide. And CSA also added in a new classification, the Y class. Now, Y lanyards have been around forever. They've just never had their own classification. So now that classification exists. And the main design requirement is that a Y lanyard shall contain at least 1 energy absorber. So the energy absorber must be integral to the construction of the Y lanyard. Next slide. Another labeling requirement that CSA added is that all lanyards that do not have an integral energy absorber must include this this new warning, where it says warning for fall arrest, and energy absorber is recommended to be used with this lanyard. That's a new requirement. So any positioning lanyard, like you see, is going to have that warning on the label. Next slide. Again, there was a white paper that 3M published that kind of went over and summarized the changes to the shock absorbing lanyard standard. And we can get that out to you. Just reach out to your Vallen rep. Next slide. Whenever you're talking about shock absorbing lanyards, it's always important to consider your clearance requirements. I still think this is a part of fall arrest that unfortunately is all too often overlooked. So this is a simple way of looking at what your required fall clearance distance is with using as an example, a 6-foot shock absorbing lanyard. So the required fall clearance distance from your anchor point is 17.5 feet. Okay, so if you look at the length of the lanyard, which is 6 feet, the deceleration distance, which could be up to 4 feet, the height of the worker, which we'll use 6 feet as just a round number, and then there's a safety factor of 1.5 feet built into that. So you need 17.5 feet of clearance when using a 6-foot shock absorbing lanyard. Compare that to a personal fall limiter or a personal SRL. Many of them today, as if you're anchoring above your dorsal D-ring height, your clearance requirement can be as low as 4 feet. So it's a significant improvement. Whenever I'm talking with end users, I always want to highlight that difference because it really does remove a lot of a lot of the hazards involved in setting up your fall arrest system, and that clearance requirement is a really big, it's an important consideration. Next slide. Fall arresters and vertical lifelines. So there was a change made here as well to this standard, Z259.2.5. Came into effect June 1st of 2019. Really the main changes, just move to the next slide, just in the interest of time. This is the main change that occurred. So rope grabs must now have the connector integrated into the grab. Okay, so what that means is the length of lanyard, or that connecting device between the rope grab and your full body harness, that connector must be integrated into the rope grab. So, and the reason is there were way too many people attaching 6-foot shock absorbing lanyards to rope grabs, far exceeding the design of these devices. So really the integration requirement prevents the use of longer lanyards, which will prevent long free falls, basically, right? If you have a 6-foot shock absorbing lanyard attached to a rope grab, and that rope grab happens to be below your dorsal D-ring, you're going for a long ride before you reach the end of that lanyard. So the maximum dorsal connector length is now 30 inches, 2.5 feet. So that a rope grab that you attach to your back D-ring, 2.5 feet. For grabs that follow cable, 9 inches. 9 inches is the maximum ventral length for the connector. So for ladder climbing. The energy absorbers that are built into these, you've got an average arresting force of 1,350 pounds and a maximum arresting force of 1,800 pounds. The other main thing is that all devices must be sold and used on the lifelines on which they were tested. So the CSA approval isn't just on the rope grab. The CSA approval is on the rope grab and the vertical lifeline that it is meant to be attached to. So what that means is if you're mixing and matching manufacturers, you're likely not going to have a CSA approved system. Okay, so rope grab, rope, same manufacturer, tested by CSA as a system. Next slide. And lastly, full body harnesses. So another change to the CSA standard, and this came into effect, I guess, last year. It was written in 2018, but came into effect last year. Really, the big change is a whole new harness classification, which is a Class R, which is for arc flash. They also added in some requirements, some new requirements for controlling shoulder separation on the harness. Next slide. So a Class R harness is arc resistant. So Class R full body harnesses are designed to provide protection for workers who could be exposed to thermal hazards of momentary electric arc or flame. So in addition to the connector required for a Class A harness, so that's your rest harness, so a back D-ring, Class R harnesses can also include all the other classifications, which I'll cover on the next slide. So now there's a formal class for an arc flash harness. With regards to shoulder strap separation, CSA added a new requirement to ensure that all full body harnesses permanently incorporate either a waist belt or some type of back strap or other means of controlling the separation of the shoulder strap on the back side of the full body harness. Next slide. So just as a reminder, all of your different harness classifications. So a Class A harness is for fall arrest. So that's a single back D-ring, dorsal D-ring harness. So all harnesses by definition are Class A. Okay. Class P would be for positioning. So those are your two side D-rings for positioning. Class L is a harness with a front D-ring rated for ladder climbing. Class E is what we call limited access. So those are shoulder D-rings intended for workers to be raised and lowered into really tight confined spaces where you need that body to be perfectly straight up and down. A Class D is rated for suspension and descent. And then a Class R, which is arc flash. And a Class R harness can be a combination of all the other classes. Next slide. So that pretty much covers the CSA standard changes as quickly as I could. If you've got questions, by all means, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Brad. I actually have a question going through that. With regards to SRLs and the proper use and maintaining them, how long does it, and you're using it, let's say 3-4 times a year, how long can a customer expect that SRL to last them?
Oh, geez, it can last a very long time for using it that infrequent. So that would fall under the infrequent to light use.
Yeah.
If we went back to that slide, to that table, you'd see that the revalidation frequency for that type of use would be at least every 5 years. Okay. So you would need to send an SRL in for revalidation for potentially up to 5 years. Now, there is a competent person inspection requirement still. I can't remember the table. I think it's every 2 years for infrequent to light. So if the competent inspector, for whatever reason, they determined that, you know what, this doesn't pass my inspection, then that would trigger it to be sent in for revalidation. The nice thing about the changes to the standard as far as revalidation goes is it's no longer from the date of manufacture. That has nothing to do with it anymore. It's from the date that the SRL is put into service, right? So Vallen can have inventory of SRLs on their shelf, sell them to the end user. It doesn't matter when that product was manufactured, as long as it's approved to the new standard, okay? Once it's actually purchased and then placed into service, that's when the inspection frequency and the revalidation frequency would come into play.
Or the clock starts ticking. Yes, yeah. The other thing, just to note to all of our audience members there, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat. Also, we will be posting this recorded webinar onto our vallen.ca website, so you can share with your team members any of these critical little pieces of information. Thank you, Brad, very much.
Thank you.
Stephanie? Beautiful. Gord Hayes will be speaking to keto and chain fall inspections before and after